I took the job because it was simple. That was the word they used in the listing. Simple. Lighthouse keeper, seasonal contract, October through March. Remote island station off the coast of Maine, accessible by supply boat twice monthly. Duties included maintaining the light, monitoring weather conditions, logging observations, and ensuring continuous overnight operation of the beacon. Room and board provided. No prior experience required, though maritime familiarity was preferred. I didn't have maritime familiarity. What I had was a need to be somewhere quiet, a willingness to work alone, and a savings account that had been contracting steadily for 8 months. The listing didn't ask for much. I didn't have much to offer. It seemed like a reasonable exchange. The island was called Harken Rock, though I've never found that name on any nautical chart I've looked at since. It sat roughly 11 miles off the coast, far enough that the mainland was only visible on the clearest days as a thin, dark line pressed against the horizon. The island itself was small, maybe 3 acres of granite and scrub grass, shaped roughly like a tooth, narrow at the waterline and wider at the top where the lighthouse stood. The tower was old, built in the 1870s according to a brass plaque mounted near the base that had gone green with oxidation. Attached to it was a small keeper's quarters, a single room with a cot, a wood stove, a table, a chair, and shelving that held canned food, logbooks, and a battery-powered radio that picked up the Coast Guard frequency if the weather was cooperative. The supply boat brought me over on a Tuesday in early October. The captain was a quiet man named Therian who ran deliveries to a handful of island stations along the coast. He helped me carry my bags up the stone steps cut into the rock face and left 2 crates of provisions on the kitchen floor without being asked. The outgoing keeper was still there, a man named Pollard, though I only learned his name later from the logbooks. He was in his late 50s, maybe older, with a face that looked like it had been left outside for several seasons. He didn't say much during the handover. He showed me how to check the fuel reservoir for the lamp, how to wind the clockwork mechanism that rotated the lens assembly, and how to clean the glass panels of the lantern room without leaving streaks that could distort the beam. He showed me the logbook and explained the format: date, time, weather, wind direction and estimated speed, visibility, sea state, and any observations worth recording. He said most nights would be the same entry repeated. He said that was fine. We stood in the lantern room together, both of us looking out at the gray water. The Fresnel lens was enormous up close, a tiered glass structure that looked like a frozen waterfall. Even unlit, it caught the dim afternoon light and bent it into faint prismatic arcs on the walls. Pollard checked the oil reservoir one last time, adjusted a valve I couldn't see, and then turned to me, with his coat already buttoned. He said, "Don't turn off the light." I waited for him to elaborate. He didn't. He said it the same way someone might say, "Don't forget to lock the door," or "Make sure you eat something before bed." It was delivered as maintenance advice, not a warning. There was no gravity in his voice, no pause for emphasis. He picked up his bag, nodded once, and walked down the spiral stairs. I heard his boots on the stone steps outside, and then I heard the supply boat's engine cough to life, and then there was only the sound of water hitting rock, which is a sound that never stops on an island like that, and which, after a while, you stop hearing entirely, the way you stop hearing your own breathing. The first week was good. I don't say that with any reservation. It was genuinely good. The work was physical and predictable, and the rhythm of it suited me in a way I hadn't expected. Each day had the same shape. I woke early, usually before dawn, because the cot was not comfortable, and because the cold had a way of finding the gaps in the blankets no matter how I arranged them. I lit the wood stove and boiled water for coffee, which I drank black from a tin mug while sitting at the table and watching the sky lighten through the small window that faced east. The sunrise over open ocean is not dramatic the way people imagine. Most mornings it was just a slow change in the quality of the gray, from dark to pale, like a photograph developing. But it was consistent. Every morning the light came back, and every morning I was there to see it. After coffee, I climbed the tower to inspect the lantern room. The light ran through the night on a kerosene oil system that was old but well maintained. The reservoir held enough fuel for roughly 14 hours of continuous burn, which was more than sufficient for the longest autumn nights, but it still needed to be checked and topped off each morning. I would extinguish the lamp at dawn. This was standard procedure, not a violation of Pollard's instruction, since the light was only required from dusk to dawn, and then clean the soot from the interior of the glass panels. The Fresnel lens itself needed cleaning less frequently, but I checked it daily anyway because there was time, and because being thorough with the lens felt important in a way that went beyond duty. The lens was beautiful. I don't think I'm overstating that. The way it took a single flame and organized it into something that could reach across miles of open water. There was an elegance to the engineering that I found quietly satisfying. After the morning inspection, I logged the overnight conditions. Then I spent the middle of the day on general maintenance, checking the exterior of the tower for cracks in the mortar, clearing debris from the stone steps, inspecting the small dock where the supply boat tied up, splitting firewood, inventorying provisions. These tasks were never urgent, but they filled the hours in a way that felt productive, and on an island where there is nothing to do that you don't create for yourself, that matters more than you might think. In the late afternoon, I lit the lamp again, adjusted the clockwork mechanism that rotated the lens, and watched the beam begin its sweep across the darkening water. The rotation was slow, one full turn every 90 seconds, and the beam itself was a clean white bar that cut through the dusk and reached out to the horizon. I would watch it for a while from the gallery outside the lantern room, feeling the wind and listening to the mechanical ticking of the clockwork inside, and then I would go downstairs and eat something, and read, or sit and do nothing at all. I went to bed early. The lamp burned through the night without supervision, though I set a habit of waking once around 2 or 3 in the morning to climb the tower and verify that everything was operating normally. It always was. The isolation didn't bother me the way I thought it might. I had expected loneliness, or at least boredom, but what I found instead was a kind of spatial quiet that I didn't know I'd been missing. There was no one to perform for, no conversations to navigate or anticipate. My thoughts moved at their own pace, and for the first time in what felt like years, I wasn't trying to manage them. I just let them go where they went, which was mostly nowhere in particular. I thought about the weather. I thought about what I would eat for dinner. I thought about how the color of the ocean changed from hour to hour, green to gray to black to something almost blue in the early morning. I thought about nothing at all, and that was fine too. The radio was mostly static. Twice during the first week, I picked up fragments of Coast Guard chatter, routine position checks, a weather advisory for the outer islands. but the signal was inconsistent and I didn't try very hard to hold on to it. The radio was there for emergencies, and there were no emergencies. The supply boat would come on the 15th of October with more fuel and food, and until then, I was alone and the work was simple, and the days passed one into the next with a regularity that I found genuinely comforting. I mention all of this because I want to be clear about my state of mind during what came after. I was not anxious. I was not depressed. I was not predisposed to seeing things that weren't there or interpreting ordinary phenomena as extraordinary. I was rested. I was fed. I was doing a job I understood. And I was, as much as I've ever been, at ease. Whatever I noticed in the weeks that followed, I noticed from a place of relative clarity. I want that to be understood. The first thing I can point to happened on the 9th night. I was in the lantern room doing my late check, standing beside the lens and watching the beam rotate. The sky was overcast, no moon, no stars, and the water beyond the island was uniformly dark. The beam swept out across that darkness in its regular 90-second interval, and for most of its arc it illuminated exactly what you would expect. The surface of the ocean within a few hundred yards, the white edges of waves, the faint shapes of swells moving toward shore. But at one point in the rotation, roughly northwest, the beam seemed to reach farther than it should have. Not dramatically, not impossibly, just slightly farther. The light touched something at a distance that didn't match the distances it achieved in the rest of its sweep. As if the air in that direction were clearer, or the water more reflective, or some condition I couldn't identify, was allowing the beam to carry a little longer than the physics of these situations suggested it should. I watched for several rotations. The effect was consistent. Every time the beam passed through that northwest arc, it seemed to extend. It was subtle enough that I might not have noticed it if I hadn't been watching the full rotation with nothing else to focus on, and it was subtle enough that I immediately offered myself several reasonable explanations. Variations in atmospheric density, a temperature differential over the water creating a refractive layer, a distant fog bank that was catching the light at its leading edge. These were all plausible. I noted the observation in the logbook. Beam appears to carry slightly farther in NW arc, possible atmospheric refraction, and went back to bed. The next morning, I thought about it only briefly. The way you think about a noise you heard in the night that turned out to be the wind. It was the kind of thing that might have warranted a follow-up observation under different circumstances, but it didn't feel urgent, and the day had its own tasks. I cleaned the lens, topped the reservoir, logged the weather clear, temperature dropping, wind from the east at maybe 10 knots, and went about the rest of my routine. But I watched more carefully that night and the night after. The effect was still there. Northwest arc, a slight but perceptible extension of the beam's reach. I tried to measure it by reference points, but out on open water, there were no fixed objects to mark distance against. I thought about asking Therian when the supply boat came, or trying to reach the Coast Guard on the radio to ask whether there was a known atmospheric phenomenon in this area that might account for it. But neither option felt proportional to the observation. It was a minor anomaly in how light traveled over water. It didn't affect the operation of the lighthouse. It didn't require action. So I logged it consistently, and I watched, and I let it be what it was. On the 12th day, I pulled the older logbooks off the shelf. There were 6 of them, spanning roughly 4 years of continuous occupation, kept by what appeared to be 3 different keepers before Pollard. Pollard's own entries were the most recent and the most sparse. He logged weather and time and almost nothing else. His handwriting was small and cramped, and his observations column was nearly always left blank or filled with a single word: nominal. The keeper before Pollard, whose name seemed to be Elias Marsh, based on a signature on the inside cover of one of the volumes, was more thorough. He logged weather in detail, not just conditions, but descriptions. Ceiling low, fog forming at the waterline and lifting by 0300. Unusual stillness, no wind from any quarter for 6 hours, sea like glass. He noted bird movements, tidal irregularities, changes in the color of the water. His entries were careful and observant, and for the first 2 logbooks he filled, entirely unremarkable. In the 3rd logbook, the entries began to change. The change was gradual. It started with observations that were slightly outside the expected scope of what a lighthouse keeper would record. Beam interaction with surface water appears inconsistent at distance. That was the first one that caught my attention. It was dated March 14th of a year I'll leave unspecified, and it was written in the same careful handwriting as everything else, with no additional emphasis or annotation. It was followed 4 nights later by another. NW arc continues to show extended reach. No corresponding atmospheric explanation logged by Portland Station. And then, a week after that, reflective anomaly at beam's apparent terminus, brief, duration, less than 1 rotation, did not recur. I sat at the table with the logbook open and read that entry 3 times. Reflective anomaly at the beam's apparent terminus. He had seen something at the farthest point the light reached, something that reflected. He noted it once and did not mention it again for 17 days, and when he did, the entry was shorter. Anomaly again, same location, same duration. There were perhaps a dozen such entries scattered across the remaining pages of that logbook, and they were interspersed with completely normal weather observations and maintenance records. Marsh didn't editorialize. He didn't speculate about what he was seeing. He recorded it the same way he recorded wind speed or cloud cover, as data. The last third of his final logbook became progressively less detailed in all respects. The weather observations shortened. The timestamps grew irregular, not in a way that suggested distress or decline, but in a way that suggested a person who had decided that the important thing wasn't what he wrote down, but what he did. His final entry was brief. Light operational, fuel adequate, handing over to replacement. Then Pollard's entries began, and the observation columns went mostly blank. I put the logbooks back on the shelf and sat for a while, listening to the wind outside. It was blowing from the north, which it hadn't done since I'd arrived, and the sound it made against the tower was different from the eastern or western winds, lower, more sustained, without the gusting variation. I thought about Marsh's entries. I thought about how easy it would be to read significance into them that wasn't there. A man alone on a rock for months at a time sees something odd in the water, notes it down, and moves on. The ocean is full of things that catch light unexpectedly. Bioluminescence, floating debris, unusual wave formations. A keeper stationed here through the winter would see all manner of optical effects that a person more accustomed to the environment might dismiss without comment. Marsh was thorough, and he recorded what he saw, and what he saw was probably nothing. I believed that. I want to be clear that I believed that completely when I went up to light the lamp that evening, and I continued to believe it when, during my late check that night, the beam swept through the northwest arc, and I saw, for the first time, something at its farthest visible edge that was not the surface of the water. It was there for less than a second. The beam reached its apparent maximum extension in that direction, and at the very point where the light dissolved into darkness, there was a shape, not a solid form, not anything I could describe with architectural or biological language. It was more like a gathering in a place where the darkness was not uniform, as if something in that location was denser or more organized than the water and air around it, and the beam, at the extreme limit of its reach, was just barely making that difference visible. The beam moved on, the shape was gone, and the next time the beam returned to that arc, the water was just water, and the dark was just dark. I stood there for a long time. My hands were on the railing of the gallery, and they were cold, and I became very aware of that coldness and of the fact that my heart rate had not changed. I was not frightened. That's important to say. What I felt was closer to recognition, the sensation of confirming something you'd suspected but hadn't articulated. Marsh had seen this. He had recorded it plainly, without alarm, and he had continued to do his job. Pollard had presumably seen it too, or known about it, and his response had been to write nominal in the observation column and hand the station over to someone else with a single instruction: don't turn off the light. I went downstairs and opened the logbook and sat with my pen over the observation column for several minutes. Then I wrote, brief visual anomaly at NW beam terminus, non-recurring during this watch, consistent with Marsh entries, no action taken. I closed the book and went to bed and lay there listening to the wind and the waves and the slow, rhythmic ticking of the clockwork mechanism in the tower above me. And I did not sleep for a long time, but I was not anxious. I was thinking. The supply boat came on the 15th. Darien brought fuel, food, fresh water, and a bundle of newspapers I hadn't asked for, but was glad to receive. He didn't stay long. The weather was turning, he said, and he wanted to make the mainland before dark. I helped him unload and then stood on the dock while he coiled his lines, and I thought about asking him about the light, about the northwest arc, about Marsh's logs, but I didn't, for a reason that I've turned over many times since, and that I think comes down to this. The question, spoken aloud, would have sounded wrong. Not crazy, not paranoid, just wrong, the way a question is wrong when it's being asked in the wrong context. Darien was a practical man with a boat schedule and weather to worry about. Whatever was happening with the beam was happening here, on the island, in the tower, at night. It belonged to this place the way the tides belonged to it. Asking someone from outside about it felt like a category error. So I said nothing, and Darien left, and I carried the supplies up the stairs and stored them, and went about my day. In the week that followed, I began watching the beam more carefully. I spent the entire dusk to midnight period in the lantern room each night, sitting in the small wooden chair that previous keepers had placed there for exactly this purpose. I brought the logbook up with me and recorded the beam's behavior in detail that went beyond anything the format required. I noted the exact point in the rotation where the northwest extension began, roughly 310 degrees, and where it ended, roughly 335 degrees. I noted the apparent additional distance, which I estimated at maybe 10 to 15% beyond the beam's reach in other parts of its arc. I noted the conditions each time: cloud cover, wind, visibility, sea state. Looking for correlations, I found none. The extension occurred on clear nights and overcast nights, in calm seas and rough ones, with wind from every quarter. It was not a function of the weather. It was a function of the direction. The shape at the beam's edge appeared again on the 19th night, and the 21st, and the 23rd, always in the same location relative to the beam's extension, always brief, one rotation or less, always at the precise boundary between where the light reached and where it didn't. I tried to characterize it more precisely each time, but precision was the wrong tool. It was like trying to describe the exact shape of a shadow's edge at dusk. The thing I was seeing wasn't an object. It was a threshold, a place where conditions changed. I began to notice other things. The water around the island, when the beam swept over it, had a particular quality of movement. Waves behaved the way waves should. They came in sets, they broke against the rocks, they receded. But at the moments between the beam's passes, in those intervals when a given section of water was in darkness, I sometimes caught the impression, and I want to be careful with that word, impression, that the water's movement didn't quite match what the beam had just shown me, as if the light were revealing one version of the ocean's surface and the darkness were holding a slightly different one. This was, I recognized immediately, a completely unreliable perception. The human eye adjusts poorly between light and dark. After-images persist. Memory of a seen wave can overlay the reality of the next one. I knew all of this. I recorded the impression anyway, because Marsh would have, and because accuracy in these logs seemed to matter more than I had initially understood. I also noticed the sound, not a new sound, nothing so definite as that, rather, an alteration in the existing sound. The waves hitting the rock on the northwest side of the island had always sounded different from those hitting the south or east side, because the rock face was shaped differently there, steeper, with fewer ledges to break the water's impact. But now, late at night, during the hours when the dark was most complete and the beam was the only light for miles, I thought the sound from the northwest was occasionally inconsistent with the sea state I'd observed during the day. Bigger waves than the conditions warranted, or smaller ones, or once a silence that lasted several seconds where there should have been continuous impact. I recorded these observations too, and I tried, genuinely, to maintain the discipline of skepticism, but the entries in my logbook were starting to look like Marsh's had in his last volume, and I was aware of that parallel and uncomfortable with it. On the 25th day, I ran a test. I didn't plan it. It came about because of a maintenance need that was real and pressing. The clockwork mechanism that rotated the lens had been developing a slight irregularity, a hesitation at one point in its rotation that caused the beam to linger a fraction of a second longer than it should in one direction before continuing its sweep. The mechanism needed to be disassembled, cleaned, and retensioned, and this was a procedure that required the lamp to be extinguished and the lens to be stationary. It was daytime work, and I had done it the day before with the lamp already off for the daylight hours. But I hadn't fully corrected the issue, and as I watched the beam that night, I could still see the hesitation, a tiny stutter in the smooth rotation, barely perceptible, but there. The thought came to me, as thoughts do, without announcement. I could stop the mechanism now, stop the rotation, extinguish the lamp, make the repair, and have it operational again within 30 minutes, maybe 40. It was well past midnight. No ships had been visible for days. The weather was clear enough that any vessel in the area would have starlight and its own instruments to navigate by. The practical risk was negligible, and the hesitation in the mechanism, if left uncorrected, could worsen and eventually cause a failure that would be much harder to repair. I stood in the lantern room with my hand on the valve that controlled fuel flow to the burner, and I did not turn it. I want to describe what I felt in that moment because it was not what I expected and not what a more dramatic account of these events would have me say. I did not feel a chill. I did not feel a presence. I did not feel warned. What I felt was something more like the sensation you get when you're about to step off a curb into traffic and something in your peripheral processing catches the shape of a moving vehicle before your conscious mind has registered it. A somatic veto. My hand was on the valve, and my fingers knew the motion, and my arms simply did not complete it. Not because I decided not to, because the decision didn't finish forming. I let go of the valve and stepped back and stood there for a moment, flexing my hand, feeling foolish and at the same time feeling that foolishness was not quite the right response. I climbed back down to the keeper's quarters and made a note in the logbook. Clockwork repair incomplete. Will address during daylight hours. Light maintained. The repair, when I made it the following morning with the lamp properly extinguished at dawn, took 20 minutes. That night, the beam was smooth again, and the shape at the northwest terminus appeared twice in the first hour after dark. I watched it with what I can only describe as a professional attention. The way you watch an instrument readout that you've learned to take seriously, even though you don't fully understand what it's measuring. It was there, at the edge of the light, in that threshold between visibility and nothing, and it was, I noticed for the first time, slightly larger than it had been when I first observed it. Not dramatically, but the area of gathered darkness, that denser region where conditions seemed to differ, occupied a marginally wider portion of the beam's edge than it had 2 weeks earlier. I thought about this for a long time. I thought about it while cleaning the lens the next morning, running the soft cloth over the beveled glass panels, and watching the residue of the night's burning come away in faint gray streaks. I thought about it while I checked the fuel reservoir and calculated my consumption rate against remaining supply. I thought about it while I ate lunch, canned beans and bread that was starting to go stale at the edges, and while I stacked firewood against the coming cold. I thought about it the way you think about a problem at work that isn't urgent, but that keeps returning to the front of your mind, because some part of you recognizes that it's more significant than its surface features suggest. Here is what I was able to reason out, and I present it as reasoning, not as revelation. The light reached farther in the northwest than in any other direction. At the limit of that extended reach, something was intermittently visible. Not an object, but a condition. That condition appeared to be growing, or at least changing, in a direction that could be described as growth. The previous keepers had observed the same phenomena and had responded not with investigation or alarm, but with continued operation of the light. Pollard had left me one instruction. Marsh had left detailed records, and then, in his final months, had simplified his logging to the essentials: light operational, fuel adequate, as if everything else was secondary to the fundamental fact that the light was on. I began to wonder, not in a panicked or obsessive way, but in the deliberate way that a person wonders about a mechanical system they're responsible for. whether the light was doing something more than illuminating, whether the beam, in its constant rotation, its 90-second sweep across 360 degrees of ocean, was not merely making things visible, but was actively engaging with the environment in some functional way. The way a radar pulse doesn't just detect objects, but interacts with them. The way sound waves don't just travel through water, but affect the things they encounter. This was not a supernatural thought. I want to be very clear about that. I was not imagining ghosts or sea monsters or otherworldly portals. I was observing that a powerful light, directed outward from a fixed point in a consistent rotational pattern over what might have been 150 years, was having some effect on the space it passed through. Light affects things. It warms them. It triggers chemical reactions. It bleaches color. It kills certain organisms and stimulates others. A beam of this intensity, sweeping the same arc of ocean for over a century, might reasonably be expected to have accumulated some effect that a casual observer wouldn't anticipate. That was as far as I was willing to go in my reasoning, and it felt far enough. What it didn't explain was why the effect was concentrated in the northwest arc, and why the previous keepers treated the light's continuous operation as a non-negotiable condition. The weather changed on the 29th day. A storm system moved in from the northeast, and the barometric pressure dropped faster than anything I'd experienced since arriving. The wind shifted and strengthened until it was constant at what I estimated to be 40 knots, with gusts that rattled the windows of the keepers' quarters and made the tower groan in a way that was unsettling, even though I knew it was structurally sound. Rain came in sheets, horizontal, driving against the glass of the lantern room, with a noise like gravel being thrown. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The beam, when I climbed up to check it, was swallowed within 100 yards by rain and spray, reduced to a diffuse glow that barely penetrated the storm. I sat in the lantern room and watched the light do what it could, which wasn't much, and I thought about what that meant. If the light was maintaining something, and I had not committed to that idea, but I was holding it as a working hypothesis, then what happened when the light couldn't reach its usual distance? What happened when the beam was cut short by weather? The storms here must have been frequent and severe over the decades. The light would have been regularly reduced in its effective range, sometimes for days at a time. Whatever it was doing, it must have been doing it imperfectly, intermittently, with constant interruption. And yet the instruction was not keep the light reaching as far as possible. It was simply, don't turn off the light. The distinction mattered. It suggested that the light's effect, whatever it was not purely a function of how far the beam traveled. It might be a function of the light itself, its presence, its rotation, its continuity. The beam might be a visible expression of something that operated at a level I couldn't directly observe. Or the light might just be a light, and I might be a person alone on a rock in a storm, constructing patterns out of isolation and incomplete data. That possibility was equally available to me, and I held it alongside the other one, and I did not choose between them because choosing felt premature. The storm lasted 3 days. During that time, I maintained the light continuously, checking the fuel every 4 hours instead of every 12, because the consumption rate seemed higher in the cold, though that might have been my heightened attention, making me over-careful. I did not sleep well. The noise was enormous. Wind and water, and the constant vibration of the tower. And the few times I did drift off, I woke with the immediate need to go up and verify that the light was still burning. It always was. The mechanism was sound. The fuel held. The light persisted through the storm the way it had persisted through, presumably, every storm for over a century, and there was something in that persistence that I found stabilizing, not comforting, exactly, but structural. The light was a fixed point in a system that was otherwise entirely in motion, and as long as it functioned, the system had a center. When the storm broke on the morning of the 32nd day, the sky cleared so completely that it felt artificial. The ocean was still heavy with swell, but the air was transparent to a degree I hadn't seen before, and from the gallery I could see the mainland for the first time since I arrived. That thin dark line that I knew was forest and rock, and the ordinary world continuing without any knowledge of this island or its light. I stood there for a long time, looking at the mainland, and then turning to look northwest, out over the open Atlantic, where there was nothing to see, nothing at all, just water extending to a horizon that was clean and sharp and very, very far away. That night, with the air still preternaturally clear, the beam reached farther than I had ever seen it, in every direction, not just the northwest. The light stretched out over the ocean, and the water received it and gave back reflections that were crisp and legible. I could see individual wave crests, the texture of the surface, the patterns of current and cross-current that are normally invisible at night. It was remarkable, and for the first hour or so, I simply enjoyed it the way you enjoy any demonstration of a familiar tool performing at its best. Then the beam came around to the northwest arc. The extension was pronounced. The beam reached well beyond its normal range in that direction, reaching into water that I had never been able to see from the tower before. And at the terminus, at the farthest point the light could carry on this impossibly clear night, the threshold was visible again. But it was different now. Not because it had changed. I think it had been this way all along, and I was only now seeing it with sufficient clarity to register what I was actually observing. The threshold was not a thing in the water. It was a place where the water stopped being water. I don't mean that the ocean ended. There was no edge, no boundary, no visible demarcation. What I mean is that beyond a certain point, the point the beam had always extended to reach, the point where I had always seen the gathered darkness, the surface of the ocean did not behave the way a surface of water should. The reflections were wrong. The movement was wrong. Not dramatically, not obviously, but in a way that, once seen on a night this clear, could not be unseen. The light was illuminating a region of ocean that did not follow the same rules as the ocean around it. The waves there didn't match the swell pattern. The reflections didn't correspond to the angle of the beam. It was as if the light were passing over one continuous body of water, and then, at a certain point, beginning to illuminate something that looked like water, but was organized by different principles. I watched for the entire night, 6 hours and 40 minutes, from full dark to the first graying of the eastern sky. I did not write in the logbook. I did not eat. I did not leave the lantern room. I sat in the wooden chair with my coat pulled tight against the cold, and I watched the beam rotate, and I looked at what it showed me in the northwest, and I tried to understand what I was seeing with the rational tools I had, and the rational tools were not adequate, and I accepted that, and I kept watching. By morning, I was exhausted in a way that was not entirely physical. I went downstairs and sat at the table and opened the logbook and wrote the date and the time and the weather conditions. Clear, calm, Temperature 28 degrees. Visibility exceptional. In the observation column I wrote, full extent of NW anomaly visible for first time. Conditions at beam terminus inconsistent with expected ocean surface behavior. Phenomenon appears stable and long-standing. No change in lighthouse operations. I then turned back to Marsh's logbooks and reread every entry, starting from the beginning. This time, I wasn't looking for the anomalous observations. I was looking for the normal ones. And what I found, reading with the benefit of what I now knew, was that Marsh's early entries, the detailed, careful recordings of weather and sea state and bird movements, were not the observations of a man who hadn't yet noticed anything unusual. They were the observations of a man who was building a baseline. He was documenting normal conditions with scientific thoroughness so that when conditions deviated, the deviation would be measurable. He had been doing exactly what I was doing, only more methodically and from the start. His later entries, the sparse ones, weren't a sign of decline or disengagement. They were the entries of a man who had finished his baseline work and arrived at his conclusion and decided that the only remaining task was the task Pollard had distilled into 5 words. The light stays on. Everything else is documentation. The documentation is useful, but the light is essential. I understood something then, sitting at the table with 4 years of logbooks spread in front of me. I understood why Pollard hadn't explained. Not because he didn't want to, or because the explanation was secret, or because he thought I wouldn't believe him. He didn't explain because there was no explanation that would be accurate. Any description he offered would be wrong, not because it would be false, but because it would be a description, and the thing in the Northwest was not something that description could contain. Marsh had tried in his careful way, and his entries captured something, but they captured it the way a photograph of a river captures the sound of the water. The observation was real. The medium was insufficient. So Pollard gave me the instruction that was sufficient. Don't turn off the light. Not, here's what the light does and here's why it matters. Just maintain the function. The function is the understanding. The days after the storm were the clearest of my time on the island. I fell back into the routine. Fuel, lens, clockwork, logbook, firewood, meals. But the routine had a different quality now. Not heavier, not darker, almost the opposite. There was a purposefulness to each task that had been merely implicit before and was now fully present. When I cleaned the lens, I was not performing maintenance. I was ensuring that the light would reach its maximum possible distance that night. When I checked the fuel, I was not tracking consumption. I was guaranteeing continuity. The tasks were the same. Their meaning had shifted, and the shift didn't burden me. It clarified me. I did not try to investigate the anomaly further. I want to explain why, because it probably seems like the natural next step. Get closer. Use binoculars. Find a way to measure the distance precisely. Attempt to reach the area by boat. These thoughts occurred to me. I considered each of them and set them aside, not because they frightened me, but because they felt misaligned with the situation. The light existed to maintain the boundary between what was visible and what was not. The light was the instrument of observation. To leave the light and attempt to observe the anomaly independently would be to abandon the only framework within which the anomaly was observable. It would be like removing the lens from a telescope and holding it up to your eye and expecting to see the same image. The system had components, and each component had a role, and my role was not to go out there. My role was to stay here and keep the light on and watch. So I watched. Over the next 3 weeks, the anomaly in the northwest continued to be visible on clear nights and invisible on overcast ones, which was consistent with it being a function of the beam's reach rather than an independent phenomenon. On nights when the visibility was moderate, I could see it faintly. That threshold, that place where the water's behavior changed. And on nights when the visibility was poor, I saw only what the beam could show me, which was ordinary ocean doing ordinary things close to the island. I logged these observations consistently. I noted patterns. The anomaly did not grow or shrink in any way I could reliably measure, though I remained uncertain about my earlier impression that it had expanded. It was possible that I was simply getting better at seeing it, the way your eyes adjust to a dark room and reveal objects that were always there. I did notice one new thing. On the very clearest nights, when the beam reached its maximum extension and the threshold was most visible, there was a quality to the air in the northwest that was different from the air in other directions. I noticed it on the gallery, where I spent more and more of my evening hours. The wind from the northwest, when it came, carried something that was not quite a smell and not quite a temperature, but some combination of sensory properties that I could detect but not parse. It was like standing in a room where something has very recently been removed. Not the smell of the thing, but the smell of its absence. A negative quality. An incompleteness in the air that implied something had been there or should be there and wasn't. It was faint. It came and went. It did not alarm me, but it stayed in my awareness the way a background noise stays. Not because you're listening for it, but because some part of you has decided it matters. November came. The days shortened and the cold deepened and the hours of darkness expanded, which meant the light burned longer each night and fuel consumption increased proportionally. I recalculated my supply against the remaining weeks until the next delivery and found that I was adequate but not comfortable. If Darien was delayed, for any reason, weather, mechanical failure, scheduling conflict, I might find myself needing to reduce the light's burn time, which meant starting later or ending earlier, which meant reducing the total hours of continuous operation. I did not want to do that. The feeling I had about it was not anxiety. It was more like the feeling of holding something fragile and knowing that your grip is good, but that the object would not survive being dropped. Not fear, awareness. Darien came on schedule on the 15th of November, in weather that was rough but not dangerous. I helped him unload the fuel first. Kerosene in 5-gallon cans, 8 of them, heavy and cold, and smelling of the substance that kept the light alive. Then food, water, and a sealed envelope that I assumed was administrative paperwork, but turned out to be a handwritten note from the Coast Guard station asking me to confirm my contract extension through March. I signed it on the dock and handed it back to Therian, who put it in his coat pocket and then stood for a moment looking up at the tower. "She running all right?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "No problems." He nodded. He had the look of a man who wanted to say something else, but had decided from long experience that not saying it was better. I recognized that look because I had been wearing a version of it myself for weeks. We stood there on the dock in the cold wind, two people not saying the thing they were both aware of, and then he got back in his boat and left, and I carried the fuel cans up to the storage shed one at a time, 8 trips, and each trip I paused at the top of the stairs and looked northwest out of habit, and saw nothing because it was daytime and the light was off and there was nothing to see. December was dark. That's the simplest way to say it. The days were 6 hours long, if that, and the quality of daylight was thin and gray and inadequate, like a lamp running low on fuel. The nights were enormous, 16, 17 hours of darkness, and the light burned through all of them, and I was there, not for all of them, but for more of them than was strictly necessary. I developed a pattern of sleeping in the late morning and early afternoon during the brief window of full daylight, and spending the rest of my time either in the lantern room or in the keeper's quarters directly below it, where I could hear the clockwork mechanism ticking and know that the light was turning. My logbook entries from December are extensive. I read them over recently, and I was struck by how calm they are. There is no fear in them, no confusion, no deterioration of thought or language. They are the entries of a person who is doing a job carefully and who has come to understand that the job is more significant than its description suggests, and who has accepted that significance without drama. I recorded weather, sea state, fuel levels, maintenance performed. I recorded the beam's behavior each night, normal in all arcs except the northwest, where the extension continued, stable. I recorded the visibility of the threshold on clear nights. I recorded the absence of the threshold on overcast ones. I recorded the quality of the air from the northwest. I recorded the occasional moments when the sound of waves from that direction didn't match the sea state. I recorded all of it in the same flat observational prose that Marsh had used, because Marsh had been right. The medium of description was insufficient, but the act of description was still worthwhile. It was part of the maintenance. It was part of keeping the light on. On the 21st of December, the solstice, the longest night, I climbed to the lantern room at 4 in the afternoon and did not come down until 9 the following morning. 17 hours. I brought food and water and my logbook, and I sat in the wooden chair, and I watched the beam make its rotation, and I looked at what it showed me, and I looked at what it didn't show me, and I tried for the first time to think clearly about what would happen if the light went out. Not if I turned it off. I had already made my peace with the fact that I would not do that. What I was thinking about was failure, mechanical failure, fuel exhaustion, an accident, an earthquake, a structural collapse, something beyond my control that would interrupt the light's operation despite my best efforts. What would happen then? I looked at the northwest, at the threshold that was visible in the beam's extension, and I thought about what was on the other side of it. I had been very disciplined about not speculating, about recording observations without interpretation. But on the longest night, in the 17th hour of darkness, with the beam sweeping its tireless arc and the wind carrying that quality of absence from the northwest, I allowed myself to consider the question directly. What I arrived at was not an answer. It was more like a recognition of the answer's shape. The light was holding something in place, not containing it. I didn't think the light was a wall or a barrier. It was more like the light was maintaining a distinction. Here, on this side, the water was water, and the air was air, and the physical laws that governed the world operated as expected. There, on the other side of the threshold, those laws were not violated, but they were not quite the same. The difference was subtle. If you could somehow stand there and look around, you might not notice anything wrong immediately. The waves would move, the wind would blow. but the rules governing those movements would be slightly different, organized by principles that were adjacent to the ones I knew, but not identical. The way a word in a foreign language can sound almost like an English word, but mean something entirely different. The light, in its rotation, was continuously reasserting the local rules. Every 90 seconds, the beam passed over the water and said, "This is how light behaves here. This is how it reflects. This is how it diminishes with the distance." And the water and the air, receiving the beam, were reminded of their own properties, were held in their accustomed patterns by the constant, repeating demonstration of those patterns. The lighthouse was not guarding against something. It was maintaining something. It was maintaining the ordinary. And the threshold, the place where the beam reached its limit, was the point beyond which the light's assertion faded and the other set of rules began. Not abruptly, gradually, the way a radio signal weakens with distance until the static overtakes it and you can't tell what's signal and what's noise. This was my understanding, arrived at through months of observation and isolation and sustained attention. I do not present it as fact. I present it as the best interpretation available to me, given what I saw and what I knew and what I was equipped to comprehend. It may be wrong. It is almost certainly incomplete, but it was sufficient to make the instruction. Don't turn off the light. Make sense to me in a way that went beyond compliance and became something closer to conviction. The rest of the winter passed. January was the coldest month, and there were nights when the temperature dropped low enough that I worried about the fuel's viscosity and the clockwork's lubrication and the glass panels of the lantern room contracting in the cold and cracking. None of these things happened. The lighthouse had been built to endure, and it endured. February brought more storms, and March brought the first hints of a change in the light. Not the lighthouse beam, but the daylight, the slow lengthening of afternoons that meant the balance was shifting back toward day and the light's nightly burden was easing. I found during those final weeks that I had developed a relationship with the lighthouse that I don't have adequate language for. It was not affection exactly, though I did feel something warm toward the tower and its mechanism and its light. It was not dependence, though I relied on its presence the way you rely on the walls of your house. It was something more fundamental, a recognition that the lighthouse and I were engaged in the same task and that the task was important, and that importance was not contingent on anyone else knowing about it or acknowledging it or even believing it was real. The beam swept, the lens turned. The light reached out across the water and touched whatever it touched, and the water was water, and the air was air, and the world on this side of the threshold continued to operate by the rules I knew. That was enough. That had to be enough, because it was all there was. My replacement arrived in late March. A young woman, maybe 30, with a practical demeanor and the kind of quiet self-possession that suggested she'd be good at this work. Tharian brought her over on the supply boat, and I met them at the dock and helped carry her things up. I showed her the fuel system, the clockwork, the lens cleaning procedure, the logbook format. I showed her everything Pollard had shown me, in the same order, with the same brevity. We stood in the lantern room together, both of us looking out at the gray water. The sky was overcast. Visibility was maybe 3 miles. The beam wouldn't reach anything unusual tonight, or if it did, she wouldn't be able to see it yet. She would need time. She would need clear nights and sustained attention and the willingness to look at something she couldn't explain and keep looking rather than turning away. I buttoned my coat. I picked up my bag. I turned to her and said the only thing that was both true and useful. "Don't turn off the light." She nodded. She didn't ask why. Maybe she would later, alone in the tower on a clear night when the beam reached farther than it should, and the wind from the northwest carried something she couldn't name. Or maybe she wouldn't need to ask. Maybe she would do what Marsh had done, what Pollard had done, what I had done. Watch, record, maintain, and eventually understand that the question didn't matter as much as the practice. I went down the stairs and got on the boat and sat in the stern as Therian pulled away from the dock. I watched the island shrink. The tower, the keeper's quarters, the gray rock, the stone steps. I watched until I couldn't distinguish the structure from the island itself, and then I watched the island until it was just a dark shape on the water, and then I watched the water. When we were maybe 5 miles out, I turned and looked northwest. There was nothing to see. It was daytime. The light was off. The ocean stretched to the horizon, uniform and unbroken, and behaving exactly as the ocean should. I looked at it for a long time, trying to detect some trace of what I had observed from the tower, some subtle wrongness in the wave patterns, some quality of the air, some threshold between the rules I knew and the rules I didn't. I saw nothing. Without the light, there was nothing to see. That's what I keep coming back to, now that I'm on the mainland and the island is 11 miles behind me, and the days are normal length, and the nights are filled with the sounds of a town instead of wind and waves. I keep coming back to the fact that, without the light, there was nothing to see. Not because there was nothing there, but because seeing requires illumination, and the thing in the northwest existed at the boundary of what this particular light could reveal, and without the light, the boundary was invisible, and without the boundary, the distinction between here and there was invisible, and without the distinction, there was no way to know which set of rules you were standing in. The light is still on. I know this because the light has been on for over 150 years, and because the woman I handed the station to had steady hands and clear eyes and did not ask unnecessary questions. The light is on, and the lens is turning, and the beam is sweeping the water in its 90-second arc, and at the northwest extent, the light is reaching and holding, and the threshold is where it has always been, and the water on this side is water, and I am here, and the ordinary world persists. I don't go to the coast at night anymore. I don't need to see the beam from the mainland, although on clear nights, people tell me you can. A faint pulse on the horizon, regular as breathing. I don't need to see it because I know it's there, the way you know your heart is beating without putting your hand on your chest. It's there, and it will continue to be there because someone is in the tower right now, sitting in the wooden chair, watching the beam, logging the observations, keeping the fuel and the mechanism and the glass in the condition they need to be in. Someone is doing the job that is simple, that requires no prior experience, that consists of maintaining a light that must not be turned off. And maybe they are looking northwest right now, and maybe they are seeing what I saw, or more than I saw, or less than I saw, because perception is individual, and the threshold reveals itself differently to different eyes. And maybe they are writing in the logbook, in the careful, flat language of observation, recording what the beam shows them without interpretation, because interpretation is not their job. Their job is the light. The light is the interpretation. The light is the assertion that here, in this arc, for this rotation, the world is what it appears to be. I trust that. I have to trust that. We all do, whether we know it or not. Somewhere off the coast of Maine, on a small island made of granite and purpose, a light is turning, and the ordinary world is being maintained, one rotation at a time, 90 seconds per revolution, dusk to dawn, without interruption, without explanation, without end. And that is enough.